would there be any rule change that the banks can do to avoid imminent crash or reset? I don't think they need to. The banks are pretty well capitalized right now. I mean, the banks don't have that many issues. It's not a big. The biggest issue the banks have is the yield curve, in my opinion. So if the Fed pegs the yield curve and does yield curve control, that's the biggest issue that the banks have. But as far as them just collapsing like they did in 2008, I don't know if there's that much of a risk. There's still a risk, of course, but I don't know if the risk is as high as it was back in, call it 2007, 2008. There's far more liquidity. I mean, my goodness gracious, you got to think about it. I mean, just look at the excess reserves in the system, right? Or the reserves period. I mean, back in prior to the GFC, the excess reserves in the system were just like the TGA. I mean, it was nothing, just nothing. And now look at it. I mean, the Fed's expanded its balance sheet up over 7 trillion. So those are bank reserves that are assets of the commercial banking system. That's pure liquidity. So they don't have those. Now, I'm not saying they don't have issues, but they don't have the same type of issues. So my point is, I don't know that they really need a rule change. I don't think the crash in the banking system is imminent. I think we have other dangers that could create a crash or a reset, but I don't know if it's the American. Now, if your question is regarding Europe or Australia or Canada, that's a different question. I'm assuming that this is an American-centric question, and you're asking about the American banks. And keep in mind too, most of their debt or any toxic garbage on their balance sheet, the Fed can just buy it, just give them 100 cents on the dollar. I mean, back prior to the GFC, that would have been unthinkable because the Fed had never done it. But I mean, considering what they've done from 2008 to 2020, and then considering what they did in 2020, and my goodness gracious, should we think for 1 second if any bank had an issue, the Fed wouldn't just step right in and buy any toxic asset they had on their balance sheet for 100 cents on the dollar? I mean, that's in my opinion, that's what would happen. Very high probability.